They say power can conquer nations. But what if it could also own the human body? In the burning steppes of the 13th century, where empires rose and turned to ash beneath Mongol hooves, even Genghis Khan's most loyal generals feared what they saw in his camps at night. For among the spoils of war were not just gold and lands, but men broken, women taken, and lives traded like trophies of desire and dominance. This is the untold story of how the so-called greatest conqueror ruled not only through blood and steel, but through the silent chains of submission that held an empire together. If you're ready to uncover the truths that history tried to hide, subscribe now, leave your thoughts in the comments, and stay with me, because in the next chapters, we'll uncover this story piece by piece, each one more shocking than the last. The wind that swept across the steppes carried more than dust. It carried the sound of ruin. When Genghis Khan's armies descended upon a city, it wasn't simply a battle, it was the end of an entire world. Smoke choked the skies of Nishapur, Merv, and Bukhara. Streets once filled with merchants and children ran red with blood. Temples, libraries, and homes burned together in one long scream of history. But even after the swords were sheathed, the conquest had only just begun. For the Mongols did not simply take lives, they took people. Thousands of men, women, and children were herded like cattle, their identities erased in the name of victory. Those who resisted were executed where they stood, those who surrendered were chained and branded as property of the great Khan. Chroniclers like Giovanni wrote of cities emptied of their breath, where the few survivors were divided into ranks. Artisans, slaves, concubines. To the Mongols, every captive was a resource, a tool, a trade, or a trophy. Artisans and blacksmiths were spared to serve the army's machine of conquest. The young and strong were distributed as laborers. And the women, the most desired spoils of all, were taken as prizes to please soldiers and generals alike. The cruelty was systematic, not random. Each victory fed the next, because every human life taken became fuel for the empire's expansion. It wasn't enough to destroy. Genghis Khan's genius lay in rebuilding the world in his own ruthless image. In the ashes of cities, he found his empire's foundation, built not from stone, but from submission. Once the dust settled and the fires dimmed, the true ceremony of victory began. Captured populations were brought before the Mongol commanders in rows, silent, trembling, waiting to be distributed. The great Khan sat at the center, his expression unreadable beneath the cold Mongol sky. For him, this was not cruelty. It was order. Each general received his share warriors to command, women for companionship, servants to manage their encampments, and artisans to craft weapons of war. The Khan's empire ran on human spoils. Every conquest was an investment, every captive a currency. He rewarded loyalty not just with gold or land, but with flesh and obedience. A faithful general could receive hundreds of servants, while a tribe that defied him could see its people divided, sold, or slaughtered. In the secret history of the Mongols, it's written that Khan often selected captives personally. He would ask their origins, their skills, even their looks. Sometimes, he kept the most beautiful captives for himself or sent them to his sons and trusted advisors, tokens of both gratitude and dominance. To outsiders, it was barbaric, but to the Mongols, it was order and justice, a new world being carved by divine right. Rashid al-Din later recorded that some generals began to whisper uneasily. They had seen the Khan show mercy to none and favor to few. They feared that if he could turn the world's rulers into slaves, then what protection did his own warriors truly have? Beneath the triumph and gold, a shadow grew, a quiet realization that the same cruelty that enslaved others could one day consume them too. When night fell across the Mongol plains, Silence ruled the camp. Fires burned low, and in the distance came the faint sound of weeping from among the tents of captives. The soldiers ignored it. The generals pretended not to hear, and the Khan was always awake. It's said that even among his own men, no one dared question his methods. To speak against the Khan's will was to challenge the heavens themselves. And yet, as the empire expanded, unease began to spread through the ranks. Some of his oldest companions, men who had ridden with him since the first unification of the tribes, found themselves troubled by what victory had become. They had set out to unite the Mongols, to bring strength and law to a divided people. But now they watched as entire nations vanished under their horses' hooves, replaced with chains, screams, and fear. Even victory began to taste bitter. One account from Persian historians speaks of a general who refused his share of captives, saying quietly, "We conquered the world to rule it, not to own its people." But such words never left the tent. Moral silence became survival. Obedience was safer than conscience, for in the empire of Genghis Khan, fear was not a byproduct of power, it was power. The generals served him faithfully, but they slept uneasily. Each one knew that the line between conqueror and captive grew thinner with every city that burned. And as the empire's banners stretched across Asia, the weight of its victories pressed heavy on the souls of those who carried them. In Genghis Khan's empire, power was measured not only in horses and arrows, but in human lives. Every captured man, woman, or child became a tool of politics, a living token of loyalty or a reminder of defeat. When a general returned from a campaign with prisoners, he did not merely report victories, he presented gifts of flesh and labor. Artisans were given to favored officers to forge weapons. Women were handed to allies as symbols of favor. Even entire villages could be reassigned to loyal clans, creating networks of dependence that reached the furthest corners of the steppe. To Genghis Khan, this was genius. A general who received the spoils of war would feel gratitude, but also obligation. Each captive carried a silent contract: loyalty for life, obedience for survival. In the secret history of the Mongols, it is noted that captives were meticulously categorized by age, skill, and even temperament, ensuring that each served the Khan's broader political aims. Some captives were sent to distant regions to solidify alliances. Others were kept near the Khan himself, a visible reminder to all that the reach of his power extended into every home, every tent, and every heart. The practice was subtle, almost invisible. It was not enough to conquer. Genghis Khan needed to weave conquest into every social thread. Through the distribution of human lives, he bound generals, tribes, and entire cities into a network of dependency that could not be broken without risking destruction. What began as slavery became currency, not gold, not jewels, but living people. A system of wealth and power entirely controlled by one man. Yet it was not only reward that ensured obedience, fear became equally crucial. The Mongol army was a machine of psychological warfare. Cities that resisted were massacred. Survivors were often mutilated as warnings to the next town. Children were executed in front of parents. Families were divided, never to reunite. The shock and horror became part of the empire's currency. Terror itself was a tool, wielded with precision. Rashid al-Din recounts tales of villages emptied not just by swords, but by the strategic use of suffering. Those who complied were spared, but the story of the ones who resisted spread faster than any message carried by horse or messenger. Generals understood this principle. Every act of brutality reinforced their authority over the subjugated people. And it reminded the soldiers that the Khan's wrath spared no one, not even those closest to him. Mongol camps displayed the spoils of terror openly. Families were chained along the roads. Bodies were left in fields for weeks. It was a living warning, a demonstration that rebellion was a fatal luxury. In this terror economy, slavery was intertwined with control. Each captive, each broken spirit, served a dual purpose: labor for the empire and a chilling lesson to all who dared resist. The Mongols' reputation for cruelty became a strategic advantage, a form of weaponized fear that extended beyond the battlefield into politics, trade, and diplomacy. The greatest irony of Genghis Khan's method of control was that it did not spare his own generals. Men who had ridden with him since youth, who had fought and bled at his side, began to whisper in the shadows. Reports of captives chosen for the Khan's personal pleasure, of villages burned entirely to set an example, stirred unease. Some generals witnessed executions ordered not for strategy, but for the Khan's caprice. Those who hesitated were quickly reminded that mercy was a privilege of the powerful, one that could be withdrawn at any moment. The terror that Genghis Khan instilled in his enemies extended inward. Loyalty was never safe. Power was never guaranteed. Even the men entrusted with his conquests felt the weight of living under constant fear. Persian and Chinese chronicles describe a subtle tension among the Mongol ranks. While publicly obedient, generals privately questioned the morality and the sustainability of such relentless cruelty. Some wondered whether the empire would survive the very terror that built it, yet none dared defy him. The chains of fear were as binding as the chains on the captives. By controlling life and death so utterly, Genghis Khan ensured that the only safe place was in his favor, and the only path to favor was absolute obedience. Thus, slavery, terror, and loyalty were inseparable. Through this tripartite system, the great Khan transformed human suffering into the engine of empire, and even those closest to him became prisoners of his methods. The shadow of fear stretched further than any army, and as the empire grew, the line between conqueror and captive blurred, leaving generals, soldiers, and subjects alike trapped in the same web of control. Life for those enslaved under Genghis Khan was a relentless cycle of labor and fear. From sunrise to sunset, men were pressed into fields, forced to tend crops for the Mongol army or haul materials to construct fortresses and siege engines. No distinction was made between age or prior status. Farmers became soldiers, laborers, craftsmen reduced to mere hands without voice. Camps were overcrowded and harsh. Tents offered little protection from the freezing winds of the steppe or the scorching heat of summer. Meals were meager, often leftovers from the soldiers' tables, leaving the enslaved perpetually weak and hungry. Chroniclers such as Juvaini and Rashid al-Din describe the grinding rhythm of captivity, the endless march of bodies, the constant toil, the invisible scars that never healed. Life under the yoke was not merely about physical labor, it was about erasure of identity. Names were forgotten, families separated, and the concept of freedom became a memory quickly fading under chains. Women were the most coveted spoils of the Mongol campaigns, treated as symbols of status and instruments of control. Beauty, youth, and skill determined their fates. Some became concubines for high-ranking generals, others were assigned to labor in households or sent as gifts to distant allies. Their value was not personal, it was political. To possess a woman was to display dominance over conquered territories, to reinforce loyalty among officers, and to remind the population of the conqueror's absolute authority. Persian accounts detail the systematic distribution of women after sieges, highlighting the transactional nature of their lives. Their bodies became bargaining chips in an empire built on fear and obedience. Pregnancy, marriage, or motherhood did little to change their standing. Children born into captivity were raised without names, stripped of heritage, and molded to serve the empire from birth. The Khan's system ensured that every human life, male or female, could be repurposed to strengthen his dominion. Amid this relentless oppression, the enslaved learned to survive through silence. Voices were dangerous, rebellion was punishable by death. Stories whispered in secret became lifelines, fragments of memory passed among the oppressed. Yet these were never recorded in official accounts. Fear became a constant companion, shaping not only actions but thoughts. Even acts of kindness or resistance were calculated against the ever-present threat of punishment. Generations grew up in captivity, knowing nothing beyond chains, forced labor, and obedience. Yet within this darkness, faint sparks of resilience persisted. Some learned to exploit small freedoms within the system, offering skills or loyalty in exchange for survival. Others preserved memories of families, languages, and traditions quietly, refusing to let the conqueror erase their humanity completely. The daily grind, the politics of possession, and the silence of survival together paint a grim portrait of life under Mongol rule. It was an existence designed to strip away identity, enforce submission, and mold the conquered into tools of empire.
The Mongol Empire did not merely conquer territories, it conquered economies. From the ashes of burned cities rose a new kind of marketplace, one not built on goods or grain, but on human lives. These were the markets of souls, stretching from Samarkand and Bukhara to Karakoram, where men and women were bought, sold, and traded like livestock. Merchants who once dealt in silk and spices now trafficked in people. Captured civilians from Persia, China, and the Russian steppes were paraded through dusty bazaars, their price determined by age, strength, and beauty. A skilled artisan could fetch the value of a war horse, a young woman could be traded for gold, armour, or favour from the Khan's court. Samarkand became a hub for this commerce. Here, Mongol officers and local traders worked hand in hand, one supplying captives from the latest campaigns, the other transporting them across Central Asia. Caravans of chained prisoners crossed deserts and mountains, destined for slave markets in Baghdad, Cairo, and even Venice. Chroniclers from the Islamic world described these markets with horror and fascination. The Mongols had industrialized human trafficking, turning it into a well-oiled machine of profit and punishment. Every conquest replenished the supply. Every buyer became complicit. In Bukhara, entire streets were lined with auction platforms. Men with whips shouted bids, while captives stood silently, eyes lowered, waiting for a new master. And from the capital of Karakoram, Mongol officials oversaw it all, their ledgers filled not with grain or tax records, but with the count of bodies traded that season. For the empire, this wasn't chaos. It was business. Human lives became another form of currency in the machinery of control. Unlike the chaos of earlier raiders, Genghis Khan and his descendants brought order to cruelty. Their administration was ruthless but efficient, documenting every aspect of the slave trade with chilling precision. Records recovered from Mongol archives and Persian chronicles revealed detailed systems of classification. Slaves were divided into ranks: artisans, labourers, soldiers, domestic workers, and concubines. Their origin, skill, and even temperament were noted for allocation. Local governors were tasked with collecting annual human tributes from conquered regions. In some cities, families were forced to give up one child in 10 to the Mongol state, a living tax. These captives were then redistributed across the empire according to military or economic need. The Mongol postal system, the yam, even transported slaves alongside official messages, moving labour forces to where they were most profitable. No part of this system was spontaneous. It was calculated, an empire of logistics built on suffering. At the centre of it all sat the Khan's court, where decisions about distribution and punishment were made like financial transactions. Female captives of noble birth were particularly prized. Some were assigned to Mongol princes to cement alliances, others sold to foreign courts as proof of Mongol generosity or dominance. In Rashid al-Din's Compendium of Chronicles, he writes that the Mongol elite saw no contradiction between brutality and governance. To them, enslavement was not an act of evil. It was a necessary pillar of empire. They believed that the conquered were destined to serve, and that order was born from submission. This bureaucratic coldness, this normalization of ownership, was what made the Mongol system so terrifyingly effective. It wasn't wild violence, it was administration, and that, perhaps, was its darkest triumph. The Mongols may have ruled through terror, but their empire thrived because the rest of the world allowed it. Beyond the steppes, powerful kingdoms and merchant cities quietly participated in this economy of flesh. Persian traders sold captives to Ottoman markets. Italian merchants from Genoa and Venice purchased Mongol slaves for European households. Even some Islamic and Christian leaders turned a blind eye, accepting human tribute in exchange for trade rights and peace treaties. Diplomats visiting Karakorum wrote admiringly of the Mongols' efficiency, rarely mentioning the suffering behind it. They praised the empire's order, its speed of communication, its wealth, all built on the backs of the enslaved. Silence became the world's most common language. The Mongols' slave markets enriched cities across Asia and Europe. Blacksmiths forged weapons from metal mined by enslaved labourers. Wealthy nobles flaunted servants captured from distant wars. Even scholars and chroniclers who recorded these horrors benefited from the same system that made their books possible. In truth, the Mongols did not create cruelty. They perfected its organisation and sold it to the world. Their rule exposed how easily humanity could justify oppression when profit and politics demanded it. And while Genghis Khan's empire eventually fractured, its model of domination, power built on fear, obedience, and the trade of human lives, endured for centuries. It lived on in the markets, in the silence of the complicit, and in the civilizations that followed. Because the market of souls was never truly closed, it simply changed hands. Even in the shadow of the Mongol Empire's relentless oppression, faint sparks of resistance emerged. Among the enslaved, secret networks formed in silence, whispers exchanged under cover of night, plans drawn on scraps of cloth, fleeting moments of courage hidden from watchful eyes. Rebellion was costly. The chroniclers tell of entire villages executed for a single act of defiance. Captives who attempted escape were hunted like animals. Some were crucified along trade routes, their bodies left as grisly warnings. Others were paraded through conquered towns before execution, so that every surviving soul learned the cost of defiance. Yet despite the terror, courage persisted. A few women sabotaged the Mongols' supplies. Some artisans deliberately crippled weapons or tools they were forced to create. Boys and girls memorized songs of home, preserving memory and identity in tiny rebellious acts. These acts, though small, carried immense weight. They were reminders that humanity could not be entirely extinguished. Even Genghis Khan's meticulous system of fear could not fully suppress the desire for freedom. But the price of this defiance was stark: mutilation, death, and collective punishment, ensuring that every act of rebellion became a warning for the next. The cruelty extended beyond the enslaved. It reached into the hearts of those who enforced it. Generals who had ridden alongside Genghis Khan since the unification of the Mongol tribes often found themselves at a moral crossroads. Some could not reconcile the honour of victory with the horrors they witnessed. They watched women sold, children enslaved, and families destroyed, and felt unease that gnawed at their loyalty. Persian and Chinese sources recount whispers among the ranks, subtle criticisms expressed only in the privacy of tents, fleeting moments when commanders dared to question the Great Khan's orders. Yet open dissent was impossible. The Khan's system thrived on obedience, and even those who had once shared his victories understood that one misstep could be fatal. Silence became survival, while moral conflict became a private torment. Some generals tried small acts of compassion, sparing a village, offering aid to a child, or secretly protecting a skilled artisan. But these gestures were rare and fraught with risk. Even as they executed orders, their hearts bore witness to the suffering they inflicted, a psychological toll that grew heavier with every campaign. In this environment, obedience and conscience were forever at odds. The empire demanded loyalty, yet loyalty often meant complicity in acts that could haunt a man for a lifetime. It was a paradox that defined the inner lives of the Mongol elite, a shadow that stretched across the open steppes and into their private thoughts. The Mongols' mastery of fear extended to every corner of the empire. It was not merely a tool of conquest. It became law itself, codified in the behaviour and culture of the people and soldiers. Punishment was swift and public, a constant reinforcement of authority. Even generals feared the Khan's caprice, knowing that disobedience could bring death or disgrace. The enslaved internalized fear, compliance becoming instinct, survival inseparable from submission. And in this cycle, cruelty fed itself, oppression begetting more oppression, cruelty legitimizing cruelty. The psychological cost was profound. Captives endured not just physical pain, but the erosion of hope. Generals endured moral pain, knowing they upheld a system of relentless terror. Even ordinary soldiers learned that obedience meant survival, and rebellion meant annihilation. Yet within this cycle, life continued. The empire expanded, the markets thrived, and through it all, the Mongol model of control, a combination of terror, obedience, and reward, proved alarmingly effective. The broken chains and broken spirits of the enslaved became the foundation of an empire. Fear was no longer a temporary tool. It was a permanent law, embedded in the very structure of governance and society. Through this method, Genghis Khan ensured that his power extended beyond the battlefield, reaching into minds and hearts, controlling both the conquered and the conqueror. The whispers of resistance, the moral torment of the generals, and the unstoppable cycle of fear illustrate the complex and haunting human cost of the Mongol Empire. It was a system where survival demanded obedience, where conscience conflicted with duty, and where power was inseparable from cruelty. Genghis Khan's empire was more than a historical event. It was a blueprint. The mechanisms of control he perfected, slavery, terror, and systematic obedience, echoed across centuries. Timur, the Central Asian conqueror of the 14th century, adopted many of the Mongol methods. Like Genghis Khan, Timur used mass enslavement to fuel his campaigns and reward loyal commanders. Cities that resisted faced annihilation, and captives were redistributed as labourers, soldiers, or concubines. The psychological warfare of terror, first refined by the Mongols, became Timur's signature strategy. The Mughal emperors in India inherited not only the Mongols' military prowess, but also their governance techniques. Though more sophisticated in administration, the Mughal system relied on hierarchies reinforced by loyalty, coercion, and the threat of punishment. Rebellions were suppressed with brutal efficiency, and human resources were managed through a combination of reward and fear. Even beyond Asia, echoes of Mongol influence persisted. Europe's growing fascination with absolute monarchy found parallels in the way power could be centralized, obedience demanded, and rebellion punished. Genghis Khan's legacy was not simply the empire he built, but the methods he employed, lessons in domination and control that rulers across the world studied, adopted, and adapted. The key element was not just conquest, but the consolidation of fear into law. The conquered learned that resistance carried fatal consequences. The generals and officials learned that loyalty was mandatory. And in this system, the lessons of the Mongol steppes lived on long after the Khans themselves were gone. History often paints Genghis Khan as a larger-than-life figure, a visionary who united the Mongol tribes and created one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. But the myths rarely capture the human cost of that empire. To the Mongols, he was a master strategist, a unifier, a ruler of destiny. To the conquered, he was a nightmare made flesh, a man whose power extended into every village, every home, every life. Modern historians, including Jack Weatherford and John Mann, have worked to separate legend from reality. While his campaigns transformed trade, communication, and military strategy, they also left a trail of death and destruction unparalleled in scale. Entire populations were enslaved, cities wiped from the map, and cultures disrupted. The duality of Genghis Khan's legacy is striking. On one hand, he inspired awe and admiration for his vision and accomplishments. On the other, he demonstrated the extreme consequences of absolute power unchecked by conscience. Even today, the fascination with Genghis Khan often glosses over the suffering he imposed. Yet the records from Persian, Chinese, and Central Asian sources remain, a testament to the cruelty and ingenuity of a ruler who mastered both fear and governance. Ultimately, Genghis Khan's empire teaches a sobering lesson. Power built on fear and human suffering is effective but costly. The slaves who tilled the fields, constructed fortresses, and served as concubines were the backbone of the empire. Their labour, their silence, and their broken spirits allowed the Mongols to expand faster and control further than almost any army in history. Yet the very mechanisms that ensured control also left scars on those who wielded power. Generals who carried out orders, soldiers who enforced them, and even the Khan himself operated within a system where fear dictated morality. The psychological weight of ruling through terror created an empire of obedience, but also one haunted by its own methods. Genghis Khan's shadow extends into the modern world. Authoritarian regimes have learned similar lessons, that obedience can be bought with reward or enforced through fear, that control over populations often relies on the management of suffering, and that the line between governance and tyranny is perilously thin. The legacy of fear is enduring. It shapes politics, war, and human relationships even today. And yet it is also a reminder of resilience, the quiet sparks of resistance, the whispers of survival, and the persistence of humanity despite the machinery of oppression. History remembers the conqueror who ruled with chains, but it also remembers those who endured them. Genghis Khan's empire was built on broken humanity, and within that brokenness lies both a warning and a story of survival. Power, when absolute, can command the world, but it can never command the human spirit completely. The horrors we've explored so far are only the beginning. The world of Genghis Khan was not built on armies and conquest alone. It was constructed on fear, obedience, and the suffering of thousands. Every life he took, every city he destroyed, and every soul he enslaved was a thread in the vast web of control that stretched across continents. If you felt the weight of these stories, if the cruelty and cunning of the great Khan shocked you, there's so much more to uncover. In the next chapters, we'll dive even deeper into the secret lives of his captives, the terrifying methods he used to maintain absolute power, and the chilling ways his generals and soldiers were forced to live with the consequences of his commands. Don't miss a single moment of this dark journey. Subscribe now so you can follow the full story chapter by chapter. Leave a comment and share your thoughts. Were the methods of Genghis Khan pure genius or pure horror? The next chapter promises to reveal secrets even more shocking than what you've seen so far. Stay with us and step further into the shadows of history where fear ruled, humanity suffered, and the line between conqueror and captive blurred forever.